Okay. Okay. Welcome to the Bologna Institute for Policy Research Seminar Series. My name is Sergey Radchenko. I'm professor at SAIS Europe. We're very delighted today to host Vladislav Zubok, professor at the London School of Economics. I have known Vladislav for many, many years. We go back to 20 years at least, and have never ceased being amazed by his astonishing productivity and his sheer impact on the field. I do not think that's an exaggeration to say that in terms of his influence on historiography of Soviet foreign policy, Soviet history, especially since 1945, Vladislav Zubok is without parallel. His books are widely read, widely translated, starting from that very early volume, but that became hugely influential that now everybody has read it, and it's set up, scholarly debates, and a million undergraduate students have written essays about it, and that is, of course, the book that he co-authored with Konstantin Pleshakov, Inside the Kremlin's Cold War. And this was many years. It was published in 97, I think, 97. Since then, there have been, of course, many other books and articles, including, for example, A Failed Empire, a absolutely powerful, really punchy volume that I see as it's probably one of my favorite books ever written about Soviet foreign policy, which I always assign to everyone. And I just personally think it's absolutely an astonishing work of scholarship. Vladislav Zubok has also authored, for example, a book on a biography of Dmitry Likhachev, which is a story of a Soviet member of the Soviet intelligentsia, but more. Also various other works, including even, has made contributions to the field of IR, for example, with a co-authored book, a textbook on IR. But his most recent book, one that is really, I actually wanted to bring it here to show, but I forgot, it's in my office. It's this massive volume that is gripping from cover to cover. I've read it from cover to cover. It's about the Soviet collapse, of course. This year, last year was the 30th anniversary of the Soviet collapse, and there was a lot of conversation in the scholarly community about the reasons for it. This volume is really, it brings out so much detail and so much nuanced analysis about the reasons for Soviet collapse as to really shatter a lot of simplistic interpretations that we have had, a lot of stereotypes that we have held about Soviet collapse. So what else can I say? What else can I say? We are here to hear one of the greatest authorities on Russian and Soviet foreign policy. I'm really delighted, really honored to have Vlad Zubok here with us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Never spoken this thing, so bear with me, please. Just want to say I'm so thankful to SAIS for inviting me here. I was here back in 1990. I think 7, when my Inside the Kremlin's Cold War was about to be published. So that's the second time, and of course a whole historical era happened since then. I also wanted to thank Sergey for inviting me here. I always known him as a wonderful writer and historian, but I never known he's such a wonderful presenter. Saying so many nice things, and within 5 minutes, that's really, well, I only explain it by the fact that you only receive here very important people and very, very international, famous people, and I have to be elevated to this category, so thank you very much for this. What I wanted to do today is to cover the approximately what happened during the last month of the existence of the Soviet Union. And that was the fall of 1991. That was November, December 1991. And when I wrote my book, I was deeply struck by the fact that the Soviet Union, that everyone thought later was doomed to disappear, continued to struggle for life so much until the very end. Not the political leadership, I should say, that was split and played a vital role in destroying and liquidating the Union, but the structures of that Union, its economy, its military structures, and so on and so forth. Even after you sort of assumed that it was finished, no, it continued to exist literally to the last moment. And I always thought it was a puzzle when you pull together all explanations of why the Soviet Union collapsed, and you can pick your favorites, you know, from the anti-alcohol campaign to Afghanistan to Chernobyl to the dysfunctional Soviet economy, to overcommitment abroad, and particularly in the third world, to the heavy lifting military-industrial complex that cost too much. The failure of ideology, of course, comes, you know, when you take all of this together, pull it together, you still cannot explain how the Soviet Union disappeared so fast and so relatively, you know, it's almost like with a lightning speed within two, maximum 3 years. You know, you cannot explain it without, of course, looking at Gorbachev, and Gorbachev is not as central in my book as he is in many other books, particularly his biography by my dear friend William Taubman. He's surrounded by many other actors, but still he's central in the sense that he was a very unusual political leader. That instead of, at first he shaped realities quite powerfully up to 1989, but then he accepted realities. And every stage you thought, hey, you know, the country is going to the dogs. You know, he's losing control of finances, he's losing control of economy. He lost, of course, Eastern Europe. Okay, bye-bye. But at every time he accepted those realities and moved on, trying to rescue something that remained to be rescued. And in the end, as one of his aides said, he resembled King Lear from Shakespeare, basically giving away everything he had to the barons, particularly the Republican barons, and he was left with nothing left. So my story takes place after the fateful August 1991 coup, the famous reactionary coup, when we saw, at least I saw, many tanks on CNN, but not near Kiev, but in Moscow. And that was quite dramatic. The world for one day thought that we are heading back to the times worse than Stalin. And then after 3 days, this coup almost magically ended with a whimper, not with a bang. And as a result, the dual government emerged in Moscow. The head of the elected president of the Russian Federation, the largest republic of the Soviet Union, but not, of course, but only one of 15 republics of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin seized power and claimed to be the leader of anti-communist democratic revolution. And of course, Gorbachev, who returned from his house arrest in Crimea, when Crimea, not for the first time, not for the last time, became famous in headlines, that duality for a while coexisted. Gorbachev set up a provisional government. It was called the State Council, where essentially he presided over a group of 9 Republican leaders, including Ukrainian leaders at the time, minus the Baltic states that clearly seceded and declared independence, minus Georgia and I think Moldova. So this is this period I wanted to briefly bring to your attention. And the first thing that, of course, is relevant to what we're seeing today, and I deliberately picked from this bigger narrative something that for us is more relative, there are other things, but they are less relative, is the two-state building projects that emerged from the collapse or the seeming collapse of the Soviet statehood at the time. And one project was Ukrainian, another project was Russian. Because, of course, in the eyes of the whole world, the Soviet Union was Russia, but it was not. It was not. Since Lenin's times, Russia was contained rather than, by other republics in an intricate way. This is hence the union of Soviet socialist republics. And only after Gorbachev unleashed processes such as glasnost and democratization, the wave of Russian nationalism and separatism, the wave of Russian sovereignty found its expression, its political expression. And famously, on June 12, 1990, the Russian parliament, very different institution from the old Union parliament, proclaimed sovereignty of Russia, the day that Russia continued to celebrate its day of independence. And people wondered, independence from what? But nevertheless, it was the day of independence. So let me start with, the Russian state building program. It was briefly the program of full Russian sovereignty within the boundaries of that enormous republic, but still without very pivotal, crucial areas, other republics. And it was the idea that this new Russia that had never existed before in such borders in history would reclaim most of Soviet resources on its territory, most of Soviet assets, logistics, and of course, all nuclear weapons. So from the very start, Russia would become a successor state to the entire Soviet Union. And it's a very tricky thing. Let me later return to this important point, how it was done. Ukraine, of course, had its own state building project that combined former enemies, the Ukrainian nationalists who had been imprisoned under the communist regime, and the communist apparatchiks who previously imprisoned the nationalists. And the head of the apparatchiks, Leonid Kravchuk, started by basically insisting on a national referendum on December 1st, 1991. That he passed his decision through the Ukrainian parliament, Supreme Soviet it was called at the time, and soon would be called Rada, Supreme Rada. So Kravchuk started by that. He also wanted to have presidential elections at the same time, December 1st. And he clearly had intentions to become the first Ukrainian president. So he started his campaign, presidential campaign, by going to Canada and the United States in late September. He wanted to appear before the UN General Assembly as a leader of sovereign Ukraine. He also wanted to address two communities in Canada and the United States, Ukrainians and Jews. In the United Nations, Kravchuk spoke of the future of Ukraine as a neutral and non-nuclear state. Yet from the start, it was clear, for him at least, and other Ukrainian politicians, that there would be only one enemy for Ukrainian statehood, and that would be Russia. So he addressed the Ukrainian nationalists, citing that slogan with which he didn't identify before as communist. He ended all his speeches with the slogan that we now know, Slava Ukraini, Geroyam Slava. Long live Ukraine, heroes, long live heroes of Ukraine, which had been used by Banderovites and those who had resisted Stalin and Hitler during World War II. And later, of course, for 10 years resisted the Soviet power. So for the Jews, he had a different message. We'll bury the legacy of Holocaust, or rather we'll commemorate Holocaust. It will never happen on the territory of Ukraine. But he clearly also wanted to appeal to those who have control over money. He met Bush and Scowcroft in the White House, and Scowcroft at the time was in two minds. Brent Scowcroft, who was, of course, national security advisor to Bush Sr. Scowcroft believed that a confederation between Russia and Ukraine in the future would be not really against American interests. The Ukraine, he reported to President Bush, is the only republic that can hope to balance Russia in a new union structure. Union meaning a voluntary union, not the Soviet Union. A new union that Gorbachev was promising to create on the boulders of the old collapsed totalitarian union. Without Ukraine, Scowcroft continued, there may be little to prevent the new government in Moscow from being little more than a new Russian empire. That's interesting. It's an idea of not only balance, it's an idea basically of balancing off Russian imperialism in the future. Okay, the role of the Ukrainian nukes was raised, and we know much better that at that time, Scowcroft and Dick Cheney in Pentagon, welcomed the dismemberment of Soviet nuclear arsenal. The smaller, the better. The more arsenals, the better. Mersheimer would have understood it. This argument, but Jim Baker, Secretary of State, was very worried that it would be dangerous and the nuclear Yugoslavia would be a possibility. And finally, Baker convinced Bush not to support dismemberment of a Soviet nuclear arsenal, but approve the arrangements to pass all nukes from Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, where they were stationed, to the Russian Federation. In other words, America fully agreed with the Russian state building project that Russia would be the only nuclear successor to the Soviet Union. Kravchuk was in two minds. He hoped to swap the nuclear arsenal in Ukraine for Western political and financial assistance. So at that time, he probably did not realize that Ukrainian nukes were not a political asset for Ukraine. Rather, it was a huge liability. The nuclear warheads and bombs in Ukraine's warehouses had been assembled in two nuclear labs on Russian territory. Their expiration date was in 10 years' time, and they required special maintenance. For all its enormous scientific technical potential, Ukraine needed many years and many billions of dollars to acquire the skills and capacity to maintain and use those weapons. The Russian assumptions about Ukraine. Bourboulez, who was the top strategist and advised Yeltsin at that time, had Ukrainian roots. His son was born in Kiev. His mother was from Luhansk. He could not imagine Ukraine as a separate entity from Russia. So much the two republics, two people were intertwined through lineage of blood, economy, culture, and so on and so forth. In September, November 1991, Bourboulez, his focus was on rebuilding the Russian state and establishing its primacy among other Soviet republics. We should save Russia, affirm its independence, he said at the time, by creating some distance from other republics. After Russia had built its statehood and got back on its feet, Bourboulez reasoned, everyone, that means other republics, including Ukraine, would gravitate back towards us, and it would be possible to rearrange everything. I call it, the fallacy of economic reasoning. That, as we know, history proceeded differently. Gorbachev's wise aide, Georgy Shakhnazarov, attempted to argue with Bourboulez. A new union, he said, that Gorbachev was trying to create on the ashes of the old one would work better for Russian interests. It would keep the republics of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan within Russia's geopolitical zone of influence. Otherwise, those republics would be pulled into other blocs and alliances. It would be unthinkable to bring them back by force. Very much thinkable, as it turned out. The countries of Eastern Europe, Shakhnazarov said, and that was September 1991, mind you, had already begun to make approaches to NATO. Ukraine would do the same soon. If this happens, Shakhnazarov continued to argue, then we would get NATO on our borders. And what about Crimea, he asked? Would this peninsula, so integral to Russian national identity, become foreign territory? Never, never. Okay, a few words about the idea of Russia as a Soviet successor. In October 1991, Yeltsin gave consent to a very young economist, Yegor Gaidar, to start a shock therapy on the territory of the Russian Federation alone, whatever other republics think of it. But he had a condition. Russia must be recognized by the West and other republics as a great power and the primary legal successor to the Soviet Union. Yeltsin at the time even toyed with an alternative. Yeltsin toyed with an alternative to Soviet supremacy, to succession to the Soviet state. That was a succession to the Russian Republic that actually briefly existed in September 1917, before the Bolsheviks seized power. Yet, after brief discussion, he dropped this radical alternative. Yeltsin and his entourage wanted the Soviet seat at the UN Security Council. Sorry, Tsarist Russia didn't have it. Soviet nuclear arsenal, Soviet assets abroad. They were also saddled not only by the Kerensky debts, which the provisional Russian government had accumulated in the 1917, mostly to American and French banks, but also by new Soviet debts to the West. When Bourbolis sent a trial balloon raising the question that Russia may be the only republic out of all to become successor to the Soviet Union, there was a huge debate in open press. You know, one author, Alexander Tsipko, in Izvestia wrote that about the drama of Russia's choice, the idea of Russia's primacy among the post-Soviet states would generate nothing but conflict, especially with Ukraine, Bourbolis wrote. He advised the leaders of the Russian Federation to retreat from their folly of state building and support Gorbachev's new union. Another author, a pro-Ukrainian journalist in the Independent Gazette, now in Kiev and very prominent, wrote even more forcefully. If other republics, he wrote, oppose the Russian ambitions to become master of the post-Soviet space and the sole possessor of nuclear weapons, then the Yugoslav scenario, he wrote, would be guaranteed for us. The Russians had already destroyed the two empires, he said, of course, their own, the Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. If they decide to play imperial games again, the Russian Federation would suffer a similar fate. The misunderstanding, quote unquote, between Russia and Ukraine was very much back and raging. President Kravchuk warned publicly that Russian ambitions could lead to a serious conflict. He excluded any change of status of Crimea. He declared that Ukraine would demand the two key controls over Soviet nuclear missiles on Ukrainian territory. In Moscow, but also Russian territory, by the way. In Moscow, Yeltsin's advisor complained to the British ambassador, Roderick Braithwaite, who is still alive and very much active, that Ukraine planned to field a big army whose only potential enemy will be Russia. Gorbachev's liberal advisor Chernyaev vented his anger at Kravchuk in his private diary. He appropriates nuclear missiles, Donbass, Crimea. What an idiot. Does he really believe that Sevastopol also belongs to him? Even a super Democrat, if he is a Russian Democrat, would stand up against this. The end of Chernyaev's quote. Bourbolis was taken aback by it, Bourbolis being the top advisor of Yeltsin, and he publicly beat a retreat. Many apparently perceived Russia as an old in an old imperial image, he explained to journalists. Who reacts in this way? The surviving communist regimes in the republics, and he meant that Kravchuk was a communist, of course, just a few weeks earlier. They do not need a truly decommunized Russia. By the way, ironic to use the language of decommunization now with regard to Russia, right? Putin applies it differently today. None of the new leaders of independent republics understood in October, December 1991 that they could not be truly sovereign, above all in financial and economic sphere. They wanted, however, immediate sovereignty without looking at realities, without admitting realities. For instance, they all insisted on the immediate creation of a banking union. There could be only one currency, however, it was the existing ruble, and only one state bank in Moscow. But for Ukraine, it was unacceptable. In vain, another young economist, who was born in Lviv, by the way, Yavlinsky, that he worked for Gorbachev at the time, Yavlinsky argued, if republics begin to print their own money, the ruble zone would collapse. It's the law of nature, he said, but nobody listened to him. Ukraine continued to object. The Ukrainian leaders demanded their share of Soviet reserves of gold, diamonds, other valuables before they would sign any treaty of a voluntary union. The Kiev officials complained that Moscow-based joint stock companies sought to seize control of the ports of Odessa and Crimea. The oil producers in Russia blamed Ukrainian officials for appropriating oil and selling it abroad at world prices. The oil flow to Ukraine declined from 55 million tons down to 40 million tons. You think it's 2006? No, it's 1991. One Russian, well-informed Soviet diplomat wrote in his diary, a civilized divorce between Ukraine and Russia is not possible. Each side attempts to grab what it can. On October 28th, Yeltsin proceeded with the Gaidar plan of separate reforms for Russia alone, economic reforms. He urged Ukraine to join the economic treaty and assured the Russian parliament that everything would be fine, that Russia is on the path towards democracy, not towards an empire. At the end of October, Gaidar approached his friend at Stanford, Mikhail Benstam, who was one of the founders of Moscow-Helsinki Group in 1975. The KGB arrested some members of this group and forced Benstam to emigrate to the United States, where he became an economist, a disciple of Chicago School, and then moved to Stanford. So Gaidar turned to him to come to Moscow to help Russian reformers. And at some point during their meeting, he decided he wanted to show him a very sensitive document in preparation for his reforms. When Benstam received the document, he was in his hotel in Moscow. He looked at it and found it was about liberalization of foreign economic activities in the RSFSR, only on the territory of that biggest republic of the Soviet Union. The decree abolished momentarily all Soviet laws and controls over export and import, dues and taxes were canceled. It granted freedom of international trade to all economic actors registered in the Russian Federation. The licenses and quotas on the export of oil, gas, and other raw materials, hugely profitable business, would now be sold at auction. Finally, the decree removed the Soviet state monopoly on the exchange of rubles into foreign currency. It was a truly revolutionary move, bringing Russia from the non-market economy to a market economy. When Benstam studied the document, he was stunned. He recalled, when I looked into it, I saw a nuclear Armageddon lurking behind. The economist was familiar enough with Soviet society. If the Russian Federation would implement such reform alone. People from other republics, including Ukraine, would rush to their Russian Federation to open bank accounts and exchange rubles for dollars. Governments of non-Russian republics would run out of rubles to pay the salaries and wages of their citizens. They would start borrowing rubles from the state bank in Moscow to pay to cover the sudden deficit. The bank would have to print astronomical amount of rubles. The exchange rate would collapse. Hyperinflation would set on. It would have happened even before price liberalization would take effect. A similar destructive short circuit would affect oil production in Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and steel industries in Ukraine. They would start to export all their output to Russian companies, of course, who would immediately re-export it abroad to gain coveted hard currency. The Russian government would be forced to set up checkpoints on the Republican borders to stop the inflow of people and rubles into Russia. And of course, between the republics, those boundaries that you see on this map were a fiction, complete fiction. Not a single post, not a single customs existed at the time. So they would be impromptu attempts to control, militia would intervene, troops would have to choose their sides, and what would happen to nuclear weapons? Bernstein wondered, especially tactical weapons scattered around the Soviet Union. At some point, it was so sensitive that Bernstein called Gaidar and asked for a meeting. But Gaidar was very busy because he was preparing shock therapy at the time. So it took about a week to arrange a meeting. At night in Brezhnev's former office, the two economists met under actually Brezhnev's portrait, I think, or Lenin's portrait, I forgot. So they discussed this dreadful scenario, and Gaidar immediately understood the implications. Above all, he worried about a war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. He dialed Yeltsin and asked Bernstein to explain whatever he explained to him to Yeltsin personally, the president of the country. So after that, Bernstein returned to his hotel, went to bed. The decree was never published in the way it was presented, and the war was, for a while, averted. Some, including myself, believe if at this time Yeltsin and Gorbachev acted together and talked to Ukraine in one voice, maybe they could have figured out some kind of a deal between Ukraine and Russia that would stick. And that would have been a negotiated deal along the lines. Maybe even Ukraine would have decided to stay in the Union. No one knows. However, Yeltsin and Gorbachev did everything to undercut each other. In fact, Russia was fatefully split between those two leaders. It ideally suited Kravchuk's goals. One of Kravchuk's early objectives in his presidential campaign in Ukraine was to neutralize Crimea separatism. The peninsula was a big threat to Ukraine's integrity, just like Tatarstan and Chechnya were for Russia. Kravchuk came to Crimea one day to a regional assembly gathered to decide on a referendum in Crimea, maybe to go to Russia. Kravchuk presented himself as a godfather of Crimean autonomy, and he said, of course, I'm in favor of it. He promised to turn the peninsula into a free economic zone within Ukraine. Okay, he said, if you decide to return to Russia, it would violate Ukraine's constitution. Of course, Kiev would not send troops to stop it. Yet all enterprises and farms of Crimea would have to pay much higher prices for energy and water that came to peninsula from Ukraine. In particular, Kravchuk meant water that came down the canal from Dnieper to irrigate the arid lands of Crimea. If people left Ukraine, Kravchuk said, they would have to pay about $3 billion every year for this water. Kravchuk's argument turned out to be very, very convincing. The Parliament of Crimea canceled the referendum. The separatist movement fizzled out. Kravchuk made the next smart step. In early November, he went to Moscow and signed the economic treaty with Russia, the treaty that he had earlier dismissed. Then Kravchuk and Yeltsin made a press conference, joint press conference. They affirmed their friendship, open borders, mutual respect of territorial integrity, and protection for ethnic minorities. One journalist asked Yeltsin, "What about Crimea?" And Yeltsin said, "This is a sovereign business of the Ukrainian state." Kravchuk could congratulate himself. He appeared before his voters back in Ukraine as if the genius who squared the circle. He consolidated the fragmented Ukrainian electorate. He achieved from Russia what could be achieved, and so on and so forth. He had all answers, or he seemed to have all answers. So, justifiably, he entered history as a father of the Ukrainian nation. For many Russians, on the contrary, he was a cunning fox who fooled everyone while sowing the seeds of future conflict. I'm skipping some parts of the discussion, but for Yeltsin, when the referendum and the presidential elections in Ukraine were approaching, the moment of truth was his meeting with a liberal Russian politician and ethnographer, Galina Starovoitova, a wonderful, remarkable woman, who basically told Yeltsin 10 days before the referendum in Ukraine that Ukraine would vote overwhelmingly for independence. Yeltsin's reaction, he was incredulous. He exclaimed, "It cannot be true. This is our fraternal Slavic republic. There are 30% of Russians there. Crimea is Russian. All the people who reside eastward of Dnieper gravitate to Russia." For 40 minutes, Starovoitova went through the data and tried to reason with the Russian president. Finally, she convinced Yeltsin. He said, "In this case, we, Russia, will recognize the new political reality. We will recognize Ukraine immediately. But then we must meet with them. The venue of the meeting would not be Moscow. Of course, it's an imperialistic center for them. We should go to Minsk, Belarus, for meeting." The historical significance of Yeltsin's decision to recognize Ukraine was enormous. It ran against the grain of centuries of Russian history and mindset. The British ambassador Braithwaite, whom I already quoted because he's a smart man, wrote at the time in his diary, "Perfectly sensible Russians froth at the mouth if it is suggested that the Ukraine might go off on its own. Russian-Ukrainian relations," he wrote, "are as combustible as those in Northern Ireland, but the consequences of an explosion would be far more serious." End of the quote. However, Yeltsin believed, same as Bourboulez, that Russia would be able to control Ukraine economically and ideologically. After all, Ukraine would remain in the ruble zone. He ordered to take under Russian jurisdiction the State Bank, the Ministry of Finances, and even Goznak, the facilities to print rubles, all conveniently located in Moscow. Okay. There was the last meeting of the State Council, the Provisional Government of Gorbachev. Gorbachev is not very much part of my today's narrative, but he desperately tried to make a voluntary union happen still at the time. So the last meeting took place, and then, Gorbachev and Yavlinsky, his chief economist, supported Yeltsin's reforms, a very brave march towards democracy. Russia takes the leadership, great, fantastic, but they still hope that Yeltsin would preserve a union, that Russia would remain in a union which would be joined by Ukraine, by the Central Asia, and that would be, in a sense, a union naturally dominated, of course, by Russia. Yavlinsky even explained to incredulous Ukrainians what does it mean for them to participate in reforms, Russian reforms. When one of the leaders asked why other republics have to follow Russia's leap into the unknown, into shock therapy, it's very painful. Perhaps a separate statehood and national currency could save Ukraine or Belarus from future Russian shocks. Yavlinsky patiently responded that this would not help. Ukraine, he said, had better refrain from wrecking. Ukraine, he explained, is in the same economic and financial boat as Russia. It simply cannot jump off this boat. If it tries, or it tries to drill a hole in the boat by, for instance, printing its own currency, hryvnia or something else, then it would be terrible suffering to Russia with no end in sight. Another currency would be like a transfusion of the wrong blood type into the same organism. Ukraine could kill the Russian economy, but it would also destroy its own economy in the process. Then, of course, and this is the penultimate episode, is the liquidation of the Soviet Union, which we'll know took place on December 8, 1991, by the three leaders of the Russian Federation, Belarus, and Ukraine. And of course, as Yeltsin wanted, they went to Minsk, but the leaders of Belarus offered a much more convenient place, the hunting lodge, near the Polish border, very close to the Polish border. The joke was, if the KGB would try to arrest them, they would quickly cross the border and would be in Poland. Okay, there were three reasons why the leaders of the three republics destroyed the Soviet Union. One reason is very simple, everybody knows it. Yeltsin wanted to get rid of Gorbachev, and Yeltsin wanted to become a fully sovereign founder of the Russian state. Okay, for that he needed to destroy the last major vestige of the Soviet Union, the president of the Soviet Union, that is Mikhail Gorbachev. Another reason was to take control of economic resources and assets and logistics, as I've already explained. At the end of November, the Western powers began to realize that the future indeed would belong to Russia only. The biggest indicator was who would be responsible for Soviet debts. At the end of November, Sherpas from G7 came to Moscow to negotiate this question, and they ended up referring to the Russians and Russians only for paying for all other republics. But by the way, American representative Mulford noticed that there was a lot of hostility around the table between Ukraine and some of the others on one hand of the table and Russia on the other. The Ukrainians claimed that they had full rights for all Soviet assets, gold, diamonds, currency reserves, but they refused to take any responsibility for Soviet liabilities. They said, we have been colonized, that's it, we're a colony. We're out of the empire and we owe you nothing, but you owe us a lot. Other republics followed Ukrainian example. When the Russian delegation, which were all self-styled liberals and Democrats, proposed paying all Soviet debts, but in exchange for control over Soviet assets worldwide, other republics, including Ukraine, took it as another manifestation of Russian imperialism. Okay. The third reason why the Soviet Union was liquidated in such quick manner, really quick and surprising manner, became apparent during the meeting of the three in this hunting lodge, in this coulee. It was because of the danger that Yavlinsky and Gaidar kept referring to. If Ukraine really decides to go alone, seriously, and it looked absolutely certain after the fantastic referendum of December 1st, when over 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence, and Kravchuk came to the meeting with in triumphal mood, absolutely buoyed by this phenomenal historic victory. But the danger of the economists in Moscow was, okay, Kravchuk and Ukraine would now go on their own, and they would immediately start building their sovereignty, and lo and behold, they would print hryvnias, another currency. But that's the infusion of another blood type into the system. That's the destruction of financial system. That's the end of reforms, and that's catastrophe. Catastrophe. One had to keep Ukraine within some kind of arrangement at any price. And the price was the destruction of the Soviet Union and the creation of Commonwealth of Independent States, which was a fig leaf, as we now know, of a real Commonwealth. But at that time, Yeltsin believed it would keep Ukraine within the one kind of, common economic and financial sphere. When you read the final documents, which, by the way, of course, always surprises me, the original of the document, the key document that liquidated of the Soviet Union, was lost and never found. With signatures, live signatures of the three leaders. We only have a facsimile faxed to Washington, D.C. from Moscow. Isn't it something? Hello, some illustration of Soviet and Russian history. But if you read the final documents liquidating the Soviet Union, you read, the government of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Russian Federation agreed to refrain from any action that could cause economic harm to others. Economic harm to others. They confirmed they would stay in the ruble zone. They would introduce a new national currency only after a special agreement between them. When you read this, you realize, hey, this is a story behind it. This is a fear that Ukraine might ruin not only Russian economy, but its own economy by just rushing to full sovereignty, including financial sovereignty. Kravchuk later admitted, we agreed that borders between Ukraine and Belarus and the Russian Federation did not exist. It's true. Only borders of the Commonwealth exist. This was the best that Russian economic reformer Yegor Gaidar could get from Ukraine to limit its possible harmful actions. In return, Yeltsin promised to cover the costs of the never-ending works to keep the destroyed Chernobyl current power plant safe and other conditions. And by the way, one informal agreement that was achieved at Vyskuly was that Russia would keep supplying Belarus and Ukraine with cheap subsidized oil and gas for years and years ahead. And, basically that was another part of the price for keeping Ukraine within one zone. Okay. Gaidar recalled in his memoirs, I'm proud that we then managed to avoid a full-scale civil war on the Yugoslav scenario and in a nuclear country. Bourbolis agreed that a bloody partition of the empire was prevented. He also claimed that the meeting of the three in Belarus ended the Cold War and created miraculous prospects for a new global order. Kravchuk was more modest, but many years later, he confessed that he also feared a civil war and felt relieved. By the way, when I say civil war, of course, it means the war between the republics. And that was referred to at the time as a civil war. So Ukraine signed up to the agreement, Kravchuk said, because it could not really control its economy at the time. Russia emphasized that the Commonwealth was a form of slow divorce. I skip the question of Crimea. That's just, more to say on this, but let me finish on how Yeltsin hasted to grab the assets that he associated with the Soviet superpower status. Above all, he and his foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, worried that Ukraine and Belarus might object to Russia's appropriation of superpower assets, such as the foreign ministry, Soviet embassies abroad, and a number of other things. particularly one fact was anomalous, because Ukraine and Belarus were founding members of the United Nations, thanks to Comrade Stalin, who wanted, of course, to have more votes. The third vote was the vote of the Soviet Union. Ukrainian vote, Belarusian vote, and the Soviet Union. Russia was not a member. So technically, if Russia would go independent, Russia would cease to be a member of the United Nations, would not have a permanent seat in the Security Council, and would have to humbly apply to be accepted. Very interesting situation. It was resolved, luckily for the Russian government, between December 8th and December 21st of 1991. First countries that worried about this situation, of course, were Great Britain and the United States, who immediately contacted the Russian government saying, we must do something about it. They offered even a legal advice. The idea was to use the Chinese precedent of ceding the seat that used to belong to Taiwan and then was passed to the People's Republic of China for the similar transfer of the permanent seat from the Soviet Union, defunct, to the Russian Federation, which was done. It was one minor glitch remained in the form, again, of Ukrainian protests. Ukraine was categorically against it. Then Kozyrev recalls in his memoirs how it was done. At a big meeting in Almaty between 9 republics, including Ukraine, when the final nail was driven into the coffin of the Soviet Union, at the very auspicious moment, Kozyrev asked Yeltsin, the Russian leader, to propose this little thing. You know, everybody were already, after hours and hours of arguing, and many republics wanted Russian finances, oil, and so on and so forth. You know, many republics were in civil strife and, you know, national strife, you know, on war conditions. And, you know, everybody grew tired. And at that moment, it was announced that, what would you say if we pass the permanent seat of the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation? Everybody, by the way, was surprised that Russia was not technically a member of the UN, and said, okay, of course. So all the leaders voted for it and went for lunch. Later on, foreign minister of Ukraine tried to object, but nobody wanted to listen. This is how the Russian Federation became a permanent member of the Security Council at the end of 1991. So I think enough with the historical paradoxes for you. I think the story is so fascinating and so unusual that it deserves, you know, full treatment. But unfortunately, we're out of time.
We are, and thank you so much for this very detailed, exciting presentation that also reflects and tells us so much about the time, the tragic times that we're living in. There's so many echoes of the past in events today. I'm sure people will have wonderful questions to ask. Just wanted to remind you that we have until we've got about just over 30 minutes to talk about these matters, and we have an audience online of about 50 people. Those online, please put your questions into the question box. I don't know. I have no idea. They should appear here. Those who are here in the live audience, please just raise your hand and identify yourself. Shall we proceed? Okay. Okay, go ahead, Martin.
Hi, I'm Martin. I'm a student here. You talked at length about kind of the superpower assets and how Russia was trying to get control of these. I just wanted to ask one case that became very, very interesting, not recently, but kind of with the North Korea crisis, was the secondary assets, for example, the rocket motor factories that were still in Ukraine, and how kind of these secondary superpower assets were split up. And so I wanted to ask if you could briefly speak to that.
You mean specifically one factory?
Well, I mean, it's like missile factories.
Yeah,
sorry.
right. The missile factories, the conventional weapons still in those countries,
Right.
that kind of stuff.
Well, from the start, it was a discussion what would happen to the Soviet military-industrial complex, because it was such an integrated thing. You know, it simply could not be disaggregated in any way. And to tell you frankly, even after all these, referendums and all the talks about Ukraine's independence and full sovereignty, of course, Ukraine didn't have full sovereignty, as I tried to argue. And of course, pretty much nothing happened to the integrity of the military-industrial complex. The same plants continued to produce whatever they could produce. But of course, the key issue was the possible collapse of currency and lack of rubles. Which led to lower production of armaments, even though those arms dealers in Ukraine and in Russia were free since 1990 to look for foreign buyers and operate through banks. Whatever thing was remarkably deregulated even under Gorbachev. And the same thing continued in a pretty chaotic and very highly inefficient way after the formal dismemberment of the Soviet Union, because there was no other way. For years and years, until 2014, major components of every sort of missile that Russia produced, Russian Federation, needed Ukrainian components, and vice versa. So the real pain came after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, when those old partners had to be disaggregated and find ways to exist without each other. It was really, really painful, and probably an unwritten story in some way, right? It took a few years for them to do it. So by the time this war started, I think the process was already done, or the destruction, if you like, destructive process was already done before, between 2014 and 2021. Okay. Decoupling it was much more painful, I think. Much more painful, much more destructive in a way. Of course, the story hit the headlines when they destroyed one copy of a super cargo carrier, Mria, right there. Mria could not be built simply as a result of the disaggregation of the two parts of single economy after the annexation of Crimea. So much was interdependent all the way to 2014, despite all the rhetoric, despite all the hostility, gas crisis, and so on and so forth.
All right, so we've got quite a number of questions, and I'll pull one online and one from here if we'll just mix them like this. We've got here an interesting question about inevitability from Florian von Oppenheim. Given the rich intertwined historical paths of Russia and Ukraine you laid out, he says a conflict was unavoidable. It seems more of a statement. Do you think this was unavoidable?
Well, I never use this term in front of my students. If I raise this term only to immediately destroy it in front of my students, because history does not proceed in such a way, I believe. But I see some invitation to think about it as a paradox. Exactly because of such close links, such enormous interdependency, the process of painful disaggregation was necessary. It was first expressed innocently by President Kuchma when he published the book Ukraine is Not Russia. Then, yes, but it was necessary to raise this definition of Ukraine because for so many, and it's not only about cultural notion that Ukrainians are almost like Russians, which offended Ukrainians and Ukrainian nationalists in particular. It was really this sort of absolutely phenomenal interdependence, which is greater I don't know. It's risky to say that it's greater than interdependence between Scotland and England and so on and so forth. I would, but it was enormous, enormous. And historians of nationalism say that nationalism is such an amazing destructive weapon. Nationalism was a weapon of mass destruction of 19th, 20th century. And when nationalists on both sides begin to act, that sets in motion the process of separation. Usually we talk about separation of isotopes and so on and so forth, leading to a nuclear explosion. But nationalism can be treated in a similar metaphorical way of leading to an explosion, separation and then explosion. So to a certain extent, yes, I'm prepared to think along the lines of this sort of inevitability, if we qualify it.
Yes, no, I agree. Nothing is inevitable until it happens. I guess historians were on the same page. Do we have questions here in the audience?
Hello, my name is Roy. I'm a student here at SAIS Europe. Thank you very much for the enlightening presentation. One question I had is it seemed that in the analysis, there seemed to be a pattern of Ukraine taking some sort of aggressive action or pursuing or thinking about or considering some sort of aggressive action, or even Russia considering an aggressive action, and then being a pullback from the brink, usually from the Russian side. Is there a factor here of Russia essentially being unwilling to go to war, or at least more unwilling to go to war in this case than Ukraine?
I think nobody wanted to go to war, particularly at that time, particularly considering, first of all, as all participants at the time said, it was difficult to imagine it. This is why even I later on was stunned when I found in the Russian press and the Ukrainian press all these constant references to a possible war between the Slavs, so to say. And Yugoslav scenario was repeatedly invoked. It was so surprising even for me many years ago. It was extraordinary at the time to even raise it. How many people believed in such possibility? But again, as Sergei said, it looks completely, I may rephrase this again, it looks completely impossible until it happens. and then it gets normalized. So of course, in some ways, we have to be grateful to both sides of pulling back from the brink. There were a number of brinks. I haven't mentioned the story that literally exploded in early January 1992, when they decided that the Ukraine insisted on taking half of the Black Sea Fleet and enforcing on the officers of that fleet, who were staunch Soviet type patriots in Sevastopol with this pedigree of, insisting that they would take an oath of allegiance to Ukraine in Ukrainian language, and they refused. And at least one ship with Ukrainian, Russian mixed sort of crew, sailors, decided to raise Ukrainian flag and go to Odessa. Pretty much, I think they just watched one film that we all know, the Battleship Potemkin, and they just went to Odessa, and and other ships were sent to stop them, and if necessary, because they disobeyed the order, to use lethal fire. So some people believe they had a ship with a Ukrainian flag had been sunk at that time. What would have happened? The passions would have flared quite considerably. So we're lucky that Kravchuk understood, the delicacy of the situation. He pushed for complete sovereignty, sometimes unwisely, sometimes because he did not understand economic and financial intricacies of the situation. And he was pushed by enormous popular support, of course, after the referendum. And we also should be grateful to Yeltsin and his people for being moderate, but also what's important, both sides Kravchuk, Ukraine, and Yeltsin, Russia, they had one common agenda, or rather say parallel agendas. They both wanted to join the West. They both wanted to join NATO, clearly. Yeltsin wanted Russia to be the first Eastern European country to join NATO, ahead of others, ahead of the Poles, and of course ahead of the Ukrainians. Wise people in Washington at that time realized, not Brzezinski, because Brzezinski had his own agenda, but other people, other wise people, believed that one had to treat Ukraine and Russia in one package. If we invite Ukraine to join something, Western structure, something, Russia should be together, because once you separate the two, there would be a siblings rivalry with potential of a huge explosion. But at that time, that direction of Yeltsin's government and Kravchuk government to the West excluded, if you like, violence, because Americans at the time were very strict. They said, you know, keep your borders intact, don't use violence. If you turn into Yugoslavia, will bar you. It will bar not only recognition of your state, will bar any credits, anything, and so on and so forth. So that really worked as a deterrent, and that coincided with the mentality of those leaders for whom the only road was to the West and to Western structures. You know, that's why.
Going on to online, here we've got a question from Mil Fikre. Question is about what you have described as process of potentially stripping Russia of permanent seats on the Security Council. He says here, there have been public reports suggesting that Russia could be stripped of its P5 seats on the Security Council, citing exactly the historical context pointed out during your presentation. First, he says, is this a serious possibility or more likely posturing? And second, were Russia to be removed, how might Russia react? And what would you see as implications for the international institutions and global order?
Oh, you know, I would answer with Mitterrand's words when, you know, Russians came to Paris in December 1991 to tell him about, well, we happily destroyed the Soviet Union and we did it peacefully. Mitterrand raised his both arms and said, I could not even imagine that. So I would say, use the same words. I cannot even imagine it, because that would mean the crumbling of the entire structure of the United Nations. But maybe my imagination is too narrow for this, because this war opened, seemed to have opened unlimited opportunities for all kinds of, you know, disastrous innovations. I think we have enough trouble to even attempt to destroy the existing UN structures. This is my humble opinion.
Questions here in the audience?
Hello, my name is Omar and I'm a prospective student here. I wanted to ask about what stood in the way of Russia joining NATO and the EU, because both Yeltsin and Putin, early on in Putin's years, they discussed it openly with EU leaders and with Clinton. And what stood in the way of that actually materializing? Thank you.
It's actually very simple to answer this question. When Bourbolis immediately went to Brussels after the liquidation of the Soviet Union to offer to Manfred Werner, was German, but also General Secretary of NATO, that Russia, with all its capacities, assets, and the military and stuff, was ready to join NATO. And he was surprised that Werner, instead of expressing enthusiasm about it,
Bound with joy.
Exactly, jumped with joy, took a long pause and said to him, Well, I don't even know how to respond to you. It's such a big country. I simply don't see any scenario how you can fit in. And Sergei, knows China and the fact that the Russian Federation is the longest border with China. How you can imagine it, right? I think so. The answer to your question is very simple. NATO did not want it. The United States, above all, did not want it. They never offered. So I was surprised after the outbreak of the war when Bill Clinton decided to revisit the old debate about Russia and NATO promise of not expand, and Russia and Putin and all that stuff. And he said, I gave clear signs to both Yeltsin and Putin that there would, that Russia would join. I said, hello, Bill. When I decided I don't know something. Maybe there was something in secret archives. So I typed to my well-sourced friends in Washington, check all the declassified documents imaginable through the Clinton library, anywhere. They said zero. So this is a rare case that Bill Clinton did not say the truth.
Right. We've got, I think we've got some more questions here online, and some of them are rather broad. Let's see first if we could focus on the smaller questions. Okay. Okay. Let's just jump into this.
Okay.
Okay, so here's a question from Raj Barduij, and the question is: against this historical backdrop that you have discussed, what are your views on the possibility of the resolution of the current crisis in Ukraine?
We've been discussing it, of course, since the outbreak of the war. You can imagine, day and night, and should I mention it? My wife is here sitting there. We keep discussing it with my wife. If only we were listened to. Okay, is the option. I think, above all, what should I say? It's wrong to treat Russia as a never-changing entity, and even wrong to treat Putin as a never-changing despot who was always like he is today. Not, what he does today is absolutely awful, but he was not like that when he became the president. My biggest sort of surprise was that this guy, who in 1991 got rid of communist beliefs very easily, he started building wild capitalism. He certainly decided that Lenin was wrong, Stalin was mostly wrong, not on all counts, right? But this kind of guy is treated sometimes as an unchanging kind of mind in Western media today, right? We discussed it with Sergei, how even risky it is for someone, for a historian, to challenge it today. Because, once an evil, always an evil, of course. But, during the zeros, with all his flaws and all his assumptions, he was a different person. So I think he gradually, if you like, driven himself into the corner on Ukraine by, first of all, when he began to view NATO expansion to the east as a geopolitical background for the entire Ukrainian issue. That's point number one. For him, initially, that was not such a big issue. He wanted to join. He offered Bill Clinton, as he himself put it, another time, let's accept Russia. Then, his successor, briefly successor Medvedev, offered a new structure of international security. Nobody wanted to listen. So he gradually became upset that, listen, why you stopped listening to Russia? Why? And when Obama said that Russia is a declining regional power, I think he took it very personally. So it's one aspect. Another aspect is since when he descended into this craziness of treating Ukraine as part of Russia and Ukrainian nation as part of Russian nation. You know, we look to we seek in early Putin any signs of this. We don't find it. So at some point later, he evolved into this direction. You know, I had an interesting conversation with my Russian friends, and they said, very wise thing. I said, listen, before we had a totalitarian Marxist-Leninist ideology, but at least it was rational. At least it had European roots to some extent, right? Once it collapsed, what replaced it? What came into this vacuum? All kinds of bloody nationalist nonsense. All these dreams of greatness, the Kiev Rus and stuff like that. Who is more ancient, you or me? You know, that stuff. So
whether Borscht is Ukrainian or
whether
Russian,
Borscht
that
is Ukrainian or Russian, whether Nikolai Gogol is he Russian or Ukrainian, and blah blah blah. So you know, Putin involved into this. You know, how crazy he is today is a separate discussion. But I think we should not fall into cognitive trap of treating this war as the war, a mother of all wars, and sort of forget that you need to keep a place, a room for negotiations, however toxic it may sound, because that's the only way to keep the war limited. And so when I read articles like, you know, there may be the second Cuban Missile Crisis today in today's article in the Financial Times by Lucas, I think, right? Or when I read, you know, already quoted Braithwaite, for last British ambassador to the Soviet Union and the first British ambassador to the Russian Federation, when he writes that you know, if we proceed with the concept of victory, we'll wage the war to the last Ukrainian, maybe even to the penultimate Russian as well. But it's wrong. It's wrong. It's not the way to address the issue of security in Eastern Europe. It's the road to a full European war. This is my opinion. So this is why I, instead of reading to you, you know, point A, point B, point C, I was going through the complexities of history that really happened and how entangled it is and how many possibilities of a conflict had been mentioned back in 1991 already. But who listened, who learned, and who remembered them? That's the question. Very few people.
We've got time for maybe one more question from the audience here, if we have any questions. We've got any. Thanks, here we go.
Could you comment on the potential at the time of the OSCE as perhaps an alternative security apparatus for Europe that perhaps doesn't have some of the Cold War baggage of NATO?
Oh, well, just luckily I discussed it with my students in Rome. I taught a mini course, and they were also interested in other alternatives. What would you do if this alternative, of course, was proposed by Gorbachev at the time? It was to an extent pushed by President of France, François Mitterrand, linked to his idea of European Confederation. But unfortunately for this project, it was not supported by two great powers, United States and Germany. So when President Bush and Kohl met in early December 1989, right after the fall of Berlin Wall, you know, on German territory, they agreed that there would be only one architecture of security in Europe, and that would be NATO. And united Germany would remain part of NATO. So sorry, Mitterrand, sorry, Gorbachev, your idea is great, but you know, whoever have power Whoever has power orders lunch. Okay, or whatever is the expression. I don't know. Whoever has money. In this case, Cole had money, so he ordered lunch. So that idea was non-go. There was another push against this idea very clearly, and historians, of course, point to it. Eastern Europeans hated that idea, because they all wanted to become members of NATO, and they wanted NATO to be directed against Russia from the very start. That's the guarantee of their security, given history of their relationship with Tsarist Russia and Soviet Union in the past. So history drives and limits of what can be achieved.
Right. So perhaps I think one last question.
Okay.
Last question
Okay.
online. We have Lukasz Slusarski, who says, thank you for insightful presentation. Disintegration of USSR was relatively peaceful. He says, do you think that there have been any specific characteristics of Soviet state that prevented Yugoslavia-like violent disintegration at the time of dissolution? Let me add to this.
Okay.
Is the Soviet Union still falling apart?
No, the Soviet Union is still not falling apart. It was dead 30 years ago. But I think, as any historian of empires would quickly point you to, empires usually do not collapse peacefully. And there was one exception made for the Soviet Union, but people simply, and I myself, when I went through all these amazing, sources and situations, I kept asking myself, well, have we just been so bloody lucky at the time in 1991 and just mistook it for the laws of history? That there was nothing specific about the Soviet Union that made its collapse peaceful. Somebody may object and say, oh, ideology of Marxism-Leninism was about brotherhood of people. Yeah, you're doubtful, right? I'm also doubtful, because, you can have this ideology, but it meant very little at the time when the Soviet Union was collapsing. So people could grab arms at any moment, even despite this brotherhood stuff. It could have changed very rapidly. In Yugoslavia, it took a few years and maybe even a few months in some cases to just jettison all this ideological rubbish of the Titoist Union and go to arms with, and grab assets. Some people believe it was for money. Other people, it was a nationalist monstrosity and so on and so forth. But independently of what you believe in, those things happen awfully fast. Mobilization of hatred happens awfully fast. Last thing before, referring to the question about what should be done, I repeatedly referred to the issue of Crimea and Donbass and its historical record of 1991. I don't know if history teaches anyone, but if any peaceful solution can be found for the next generation in Eastern Europe, these two pieces of lands have to be treated with extreme care and special attention. I don't know what kind of outcome, what kind of negotiations, who would guarantee what, but these two things, Donbass and Crimea, have to be taken very seriously.
Right. Well, on this hopeful note, if there is any glimmer of hope in that very dark tunnel that we find ourselves in, let me thank once again Vladislav Zubok for his wonderful presentation. Thank you all for coming here today. That's it. Thanks.